Welcome back to Computer History with Chris Garcia. I am, in fact, Chris Garcia. Today we're looking at one of the most important, not only machines, but concepts in the history of computing. And it's one of the reasons why 1965 is considered to be the most important year in the history of computing. But before that, you kind of have to go back. Back before April 1964, when an announcement was made, back to the late 1950s. Now, Tom Watson Jr. was a guy who could see further than pretty much anyone. Tom Watson Sr. understood punch card and salesmanship better than anyone in history, I'd argue. He knew how to lock people into a concept, the punch card, and how to make money on it, and then how to sell it. Those are all really important things. Tom Watson Jr. was a little bit different. I would argue a little bit smarter as far as seeing what they needed to sell. And after World War II, it was pretty clear electronic computation was going to be the wave of the future. And that's honestly even before ENIAC. People understood that there was something waiting to happen with all the information and data that was coming from punch cards. And early attempts at electronic data manipulation sort of showed that, and IBM was leading the way in that. Now, by 1961, IBM had several sort of series going. You had the 1400 series, the 1401 being the sort of the standard there, the biggest selling computer in the world at that time. You had the 1620. You had the 7000 series, which you could almost call a loosely related family. Because you had things like the 7030, which was sort of off on its own, but you had, 7010, 7020, and blah, 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 blah. And they were lightly compatible, but not fully. And a lot of ideas there were on one machine or the other. Things like the 8-bit byte was sort of pioneered by the 7030. You had other machines doing the other things. But in 1961, IBM created an internal planning group, which is called SPREAD. That stood for Systems, Programming, Research, Engineering, and Development. Oddly enough, the A was capitalized in that. And they met in Greenwich, Connecticut, actually at a motel. And these meetings became important. When you look at a historical breadth, because you had some really important figures there. Fred Brooks, the Carolina gentleman, wonderful human being. I met him a few times and was just great. Erich Bloch, who I think I also met when he came to the museum once. Jerry Zweigald, who I definitely did when he gave us his machine at the museum. Bob Evans, who was an IBM executive and an engineer. But really the important thing for it was they came up with a report. Because what they were looking at was the areas in which they could either collapse or expand. Did they want to do necessarily targeted systems where you would have one system that would be for one industry or one sort of market? Have an entire line of educational machines, an entire line of business machines like that? Or did they want to do something more like a family, which is where they landed? And what they came to was this idea of a compatible family in which you knew almost everything that in the design was compatible with one another. It would have similar I/O channels, processors. storage, software, manufacturing methods, like everything would go across the things to a degree. There was still some specialization because these machines were individually targeted. In essence, they were being made of the same stuff with the same goal, but different planned uses, or at least different planned buyers. And this influenced particularly Bob Evans to put together a team to build a computer family. And this required massive technical brilliance, honestly. It just over the top. They had to have some of the best designers in the world working in electronics at that time. And the one name they chose, one of my favorite people I ever met at the Computer History Museum, Gene Amdahl. Now, Amdahl had been known at that point for his work at the University of Wisconsin. And very famously, he made WISC, the Wisconsin Integrated Internally Synchronized Computer, I think. Never really led anywhere, but it definitely showed that he was thinking further than almost anyone. And Amdahl, of course, had worked previously on the 7030. And he was named as the manager of architecture. Very important. He wanted to define an architecture for the entire system that was flexible enough and easy enough to deliver on the low end, but could also be ramped up to the high end with a whole lot of overlap. That's a tough trick. And his concepts, Amdahl's in particular, 100% represented not only the path that IBM wanted to take, but would end up taking for, I would say, through to the 1980s. There's a story that if you drill down far enough into an IBM PC, you find portions of the IBM 360 architecture, and it might be true. You had other folks working with him, of course. Chris Garcia, Blaauw, I think. I can never remember how it's pronounced. But really important figure who really came to the logical structure of what the System 360 would be. And it defined how software would be handled. And that's utterly key. Of course, Fred Brooks, incredible thinker who understood software and project management in a way that very, very few did. And he didn't actually work on the project too long because he went to University of South Carolina at Chapel Hill, or North Carolina at Chapel Hill, whatever the one at Chapel Hill is. But he, of course, wrote about the whole project in the Mythical Man Month, which a lot of people see as sort of the defining document of software engineering. And, of course, Brooks' Law, adding manpower to a late software project makes it later. Which is interesting and misleading, but that's another episode. Now, Erich Bloch's an interesting figure for a number of reasons, but he's sort of tied in with SLT, or solid logic technology. And it was used across the entire thing. As important as the flip chip was to the PDP systems, SLTs were to the entire concept of the 360 in that initial run. So it was on April 7th, 1964, that IBM announced the 360. And the initial announcement was a big deal because he announced multiple models. The 360-30, which is, at that point, was the low end. It was definitely focused more towards business. the 360, 40, 50, 60, 62, and 70. And it was pushed huge. Not only the processors, but all of the peripherals. Not all that would eventually be there, but they launched a huge number and announced a huge number of peripherals that were being specifically made for the 360 series, as well as techniques that could be used to use existing peripherals. IBM understood that first generation of computers, the 7000 series, the 1401s, the 1620s, they had already been an investment. And if you could just replace the processor with a new machine, leasing of course, you would be huge. It would be a massive, massive sort of pathway in. Now, what's interesting is a guy named John Opel. This is something I only learned recently. Was that John Opel actually managed the commercial launch. And that must have been a massive, massive job. Because he had to bring it to the attention of a huge variety of groups. And via that, come up with the methodologies that would attract buyers from different arenas that might already be heavily invested in a different company, Univac, for example. But there was also a problem, and this is what Opel did very well. There was going to be a wait. They knew it was going to be 65 when it came out. But they didn't know the exact date for each individual processor. It's interesting, Opel rode this idea all the way to become president and CEO of IBM. And it could be argued that he was Watson's most important lieutenant, the best feet on the ground during this time. Now, the low-end models were interesting and important. Something that's been learned over and over in computation is this. And it's the same thing, actually. It comes from professional wrestling, this idea that with your hardcores, you pay your mortgage. With your casuals, you buy your new boat. Computing, it's slightly different, is with your high-end users, you pay your mortgage. With your high-end users, you buy your boat. With your low-end users, you pay your mortgage. Apple proved this so beautifully with the Macintosh, which was never the driver initially, but the Apple II was. It's the one that drove sales, that made the money, that kept Apple going, till it almost didn't. But the low end was an interesting group because they had the 1401 already out there in the world, sold more than any other computer at that point. And it had to find a way to get them to the 360, which was a significant upgrade. And they quickly discovered that the 1401 was being used for pretty simple work. It's being used for payroll, accounting, inventory, and then as a print spooler. Like large installations would dump their data to tape and then use a 1401, which had cheaper cycles because you were paying for cycles by, run shifts and so on. It's confusing. I never quite grasped that in my head. But they would do that on the 1401, so you didn't have to waste the time on the big machine. Makes sense. And so they came up with the idea of emulation. And the model of 360 that was intended to be replaced determined what they would be emulating. So for example, your low end, your 30s and 40s would be emulating things like the 1401, like the 1620, that would enable it to run. And your higher end ones would be the 7000 series machines. And that's an interesting take, because if you do that, you're not only locking them into your company, but you're locking them into a use case. And I'm fairly certain that one of the ideas was you have the company locked in, or the university or whatever, and they were using their 1401 for a very specific set of uses. Well, now they have the 360. And this massive, growing, share library of software that allows them to look into new areas in which to use the computer. That is one of the oldest examples of, because once you give a computer with capabilities to people who know what they're doing, or at least somewhat, it leads to expansion, which also can lead to buying higher end machines. The first 360s were delivered in April of 1965. And they were the 360-40. And it could do 40,000 operations per second. It was pretty quick. And it was medium big. Definitely important. But the two that really changed things came out in June and November. And it's the 360-65 and the 360-30. I would argue that the 30 is probably the most important. It was the one that went to universities for the large part. 65 went to business, to larger users. But there were a whole bunch that were announced that never actually got released. The 360 Models 60 and 62 were announced. They were replaced by the 65. The 70 was announced. It was replaced by the 75. And the 90 was announced, which was replaced by the 92. Which came down the line a bit. And the 92 was never actually delivered. It was redesigned as the Model 91. This is the only time I can think of where a higher model number replaced, or where a lower model number replaced a higher model number in the sort of release date. The 91 and the 195, which came towards the end of the 360 run, that's in 1969. And I think it finally got delivered in 71, were really the high end. They were the ones that were competing to a degree with the CDCs, not really the 6600s or the the high end, the 7600 eventually, but with sort of what would become the star lines, the ones that were smaller but still supercomputers. The 195 especially. The 195 I've actually interacted with the most was the one from the Stanford Linear Accelerator project. And it was a massive undertaking. The 360 195 was the type of machine you built a building around, because that's how valuable the computer inside of it is. You bent the world to its whim. Now, there were delays on all of these machines to one point or another, and they knew there would be. They had been preparing their buyers to understand that they would have to wait for some things. But this also meant that they knew that this project was going to go for a while. And there were 3 really important machines that came out down the line that really changed everything. One was the 22, which is basically a remanufactured Model 30 that came out in 71 that was cheaper, that was incorporating a little bit of technology, but it was intended to be the lowest end. And the 25, which had come out a little bit earlier, was similarly idealized, but never quite delivered the sort of impact that the 22 did. The 22 sold fairly well, the 25 less so. Part of that was that by the time the 22 came out, there was a lot of understanding that the next wave was going to be here, and you can get in on the ground floor here and move in. The 67 was also key. Now, all of these had been used for various forms of time sharing. But really with the 67 that was important because it had dynamic address translation for time sharing. And it was a big and expensive machine that didn't come out until May 66. But it did a lot of impressive sales to universities in particular, or groups that just needed a time-shared system that could operate in the higher end. Because they never delivered the 60 or 62, or the 70, it sort of played in that field. The third of them, though, and the one that I liked the most, probably, is the 360-85. There is no reason for the 85 to exist. There just isn't. And when machines like the 95, which was sort of a twice performance of a 91 that was released sort of as a special order, starting in 68, it's an interesting machine, but the 85 was fast, and it was powerful, and had a cache memory extended precision floating point operation system. Cool. But really, when you're looking at these systems, the 85 is about 80% of the speed of a 95, but it's cheaper. Doesn't require the special order. Does have a significantly smaller memory, but was an interesting machine that a lot of groups that bought used to do stuff that was less researchy. 95 and 190, or the 91, the 95, and the 195 all got really high-end super sciencey uses. But the 85 was sort of the next step down. was uses that were, yeah, science-y, but weren't cutting-edge science-y. The 360 ideas are still with us today in a number of ways. One, and you cannot argue this, okay, you can, is a byte addressable memory. That's big. Also, the 8-bit byte, which is interesting that they went with the 8-bit byte because there was initially pressure to bring it down to either 4 or 6 bits, because that would be cheaper. And 32-bit word sort of defined a lot of stuff for years and years, particularly in the space of business computing. The EBCDIC character set, the 9-track magnetic tape, but what's interesting about the whole thing is just how much damn money it made. IBM knew how to sell it. And no matter the technological advantages it provided, the financial advantages it provided were gigantic. And that allowed them to experiment. This has always been the case. So the super high-end research projects that IBM undertook in the late 60s, early 70s, into the 80s were partly because they had all this money coming in through the 360. And there's one theory out there that I heard a researcher talk about once, and I really don't quite buy it, is that the bloat that IBM suffered in the 80s in particular was caused by the inability to rein in their scope because of things like, for example, buying entire divisions and keeping them around far longer than their useful lifespan, because they had all this money coming in and they could afford to do it in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. There's a point there, I see. But a lot of other things, particularly memory, storage, like hardcore research science, like in their work on, like the work on quantum, let's not go there yet, but their work on memory storage and spintronics, all of that sort of stuff, establishing the research centers that they did, particularly San Jose, all of that is made possible by the money from the 360, which in essence fed into the research they were doing to release a 370 series, which was the follow-on for the 1970s. Now, of course, the famous thing is, why was it 360? Because they wanted it to be a circle that encompassed all of computing. And you could argue that it did. All the areas of computing at that time. Because there was little concept of personal computing. And anyways, that stuff was being already left to the mini computers. But they definitely did have the circle of business, engineering, and into the world of high-end science, which is good. That's what we need. We need high-end science every now and then. Some of the interesting things here, of course, is share, which is the user group which had a huge library of software that was shared between users. And one of the reasons they could do that, of course, was that you had different operating systems you could work with. You had disk operating systems. You had OS 360, which was a big deal, actually. You had BOS, Basic Operating System 360. You had the tape operating system. You had all blah, 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 blah. But once you were in that world, there was a library of software you could access. DEC did this as well, DECUS being the Digital Equipment Corporation User Society, I think, was also really good at that. But this whole idea of software libraries and not siloing was really important. IBM made a lot of money on processors. Of course, they made even more money on peripherals. And one of the interesting things is the 360 series, a lot of them were still using their 1401 peripherals if they're on the lower end. The 1403 printer, for example. The 370 series, they'd be using a lot of the ones that they had acquired to buy the 360s. They'd still be using them with the 370s. And the 360 series lasted until 1978, when it finally went away, sort of. There were 360s in use well into the 1990s. The last one I can say for certain came out was 1999. I know because I was there. It was a 360 model 25 out of a bank. And they didn't give us the processor because I think they were taking the gold or whatever from it. But they did give us a number of their items. And they had a huge catalog of share software stuff. There's probably some that went into the 2000s. There might even be one running today. It's interesting that I've not seen a 360 reconstruction project, resurrection project, whatever you want to call it. And that may be on purpose. I don't know how well SLT modules keep, but it's an important idea. It also isn't just as sexy as the littler machines, you know. There's a working 1401, there are a couple of working 1620s. There's a Star working still. But the 360s will never die. Not as an idea, and the entire world changing. And even when we have moved slightly away from the idea of a broad family, we're sort of going back to siloing to a degree. But the idea of the ecosystem is a really important thing. There's an Apple ecosystem right now. Your iPad, your iPhone, technically your MacBook, but it's such a small segment, it's not super significant, but it exists. But that's the 360, the important part of 1965 as far as I'm concerned. Our next episode is going to do a slight step back. We're going to look at the history of programming languages from Grace Hopper all the way up through probably 1980. So we're going to go a little bit forward. Because that's an era that has so many interesting stories. Might even be a two-parter. But I think it's really important to look at it. And yeah, it's not going to take me 6 months to do the next one. So hush. But thank you for listening to Computer History with Chris Garcia. See you next time.